The field of wireless penetration testing is huge. This is its own field of study, and there's a lot in this module, so let's take a closer look. All right, some of the basic concepts here are how wireless networks are integrated into basically the corporate environment. So they can often become an extension to what we consider the wired network. They typically have multiple access points, so that's multiple areas of attack. We also have 3G and 4G hotspots, or they can be an extension from one local area network to another local area network. Nonetheless, that's great opportunities for the penetration tester. To realistically be an expert in this field, you have to know a lot of the basics of the wireless transmissions. So let's look at the standards. Okay, you're going to need to know all of the 802.11 series. All right, A, B, G, I, N, and 16. So 802.11a, this was our first standard or our series, and that operated off of the 5 gigahertz frequency. Then BG compatible was very, very popular. B was a little bit slower, 11 megabits per second, and then G up to 54 megabits per second, but nonetheless they operated on the 2.4 gigahertz spectrum. Then you have 802.11i. This is where we introduced WPA2. You have 802.11n and 802.1116, which is commonly referred to as WiMAX. Also, there's some major components here. You have the SSID, which is the name of our access point. You have the concept of open authentication, or anybody can connect to an access point, which I don't recommend because you're effectively just giving away access to that. And I get a lot of people that always say, well, hey, there's nothing on my network anyway. Well, it doesn't matter if there's nothing private or nothing sensitive on your network. If your network gets used to go attack some target, well, you now are downstream liability, so that's going to be a huge problem. Then there's the whole subject of shared key authentication, all right, which is a pre-shared key that we give to our clients, and they use that to connect to the access points. So ultimately, wireless pen testers are interested in cracking that. Then you have authentication components. All right, and then you have BSSIDs, or effectively MAC addresses of your access point, and this is going to be pretty critical, especially when we get into running tools like Aircrack, because you're going to need to get the MAC address of your access point and then use that in the configurations. Okay. Before we get into the details, let's go up here to the antennas. There are different types of wireless antennas that are used. So I highly recommend just going to Google Images and searching for these types of antennas. That way you can see a picture and be able to identify them by what they look like. But the categories are directional antennas, omnidirectional antennas, parabolic antennas, Yagi antennas. These are the things that our grandparents made us, hold on the TVs that look like rabbit ears, right? And then dipole antennas. All right, let's move down here to attacks. There's all sorts of attacks, and in a second I'll break them down into confidentiality and integrity and availability style attacks. But some of the basic concepts here are war driving, just driving around and looking for access points, and there's even derivatives of that, which we'll talk about. Rogue access points are setting up an unauthorized access point, so somebody connects to you, the rogue access point, and then you get a copy of all of the traffic as it gets relayed to the real access point. MAC spoofing is an attack because effectively the 802.11 standard works at layer 2 of the OSI model. So one of the things that we need are MAC addresses. So if you can go spoof the MAC address of a gateway or an access point, that's huge. We're always looking for access point misconfigurations or default settings. So that's an attack within itself. Ad hoc associations, ad hoc meaning anybody can connect. All right. Promiscuous mode clients, in which basically the client is in listen-only mode, so they can eavesdrop on traffic. And then, of course, client misassociations along with the access point misassociations. These are important because any misassociation, whether it's on the client or the access point, is an opportunity for the pen tester to basically go in and start exploiting. Otherwise, we can go up here to the basic style of attacks, and this is just some of the basic theory behind, how do we go around and approach penetration testing. For example, war driving, driving your car looking for access points. War flying, flying like a little drone or something looking for access points. War walking, just walking around doing it. And I guess there could even be, war bicycling if you wanted to. Otherwise, war chalking specifically, these are the symbols in which the access points can be disclosed. So, for example, closed access point is usually denoted as a circle. Open access points are like two reverse half moons. And then if there's a W in the access point, that typically means that there's encryption, which really got its start from, originally a WEP, but now I would just associate that with any encryption. Okay, so to effectively attack wireless networks, you are going to have to understand some basics of encryption. So this is its whole category all by itself. All right, so the first thing is the WEP algorithm, which uses the Rivet cipher or RC4 stream cipher, and it comes in a bunch of different flavors in terms of its key size. You have 64-bit, 128, 256-bit, but because it's RC4, it uses a 24-bit initialization vector. Later on, WPA also used RC4, but it changed its initialization vector size to 48 bits. So an initialization vector, simply stated, if you look for alternative names of an initialization vector, it's basically a starting point for, that means initialization, and vector means direction in math, so it's the starting direction of the encryption process throughout the algorithms. WPA in itself changed to a 48 initialization vector because with the 24-bit initialization vector, there's only 16,777,214 combinations of it, and you could easily just exhaust 16 million of something in today's computing power. So they changed to a 48-bit initialization vector, which is a much larger key space. You have to understand the basics of TKIP. This uses a 64-bit message integrity code, or MIC. So what I highly recommend here is just a basic Wikipedia on each one of these, WEP, TKIP, AES, CCNP, and that is more than enough to get the background on where the stuff comes from. All right, so TKIP is Temporal Key Integrity Protocol, or the time changing of your keys. You have AES defined in 802.11i, which is good, strong encryption, as opposed to RC4, which is not really one of the best encryption algorithms. Then you have your extensible authentication protocols. This is another great thing to do a Wikipedia on, because it'll actually list out all of the different types of extensible authentication protocols. Then, of course, you have WPA2, which supersedes that of WPA, and this is our first really FIPS 140-2 compliant wireless standard, if you will, which can operate in a standalone mode, or you can do a WPA2 Enterprise, which is now connecting your wireless infrastructure to some sort of corporate infrastructure and using something like a Radius or a TACAX to actually handle the identification, authentication, authorization, and accounting components. Then you have the whole LEAP and PEEP and all of the things that end in EAP. These also fall into the authentication and encryption world, so this is huge. And then the whole subject of temporal keys in itself, because you have to understand the four-way handshake of anonces and things like that, or message integrity codes, or pairwise transient keys. All of this stuff is easily looked up on Wikipedia, so I don't want to get into the details of all of the encryption now, but you absolutely are going to see this surface when we start configuring the access points and doing our penetration testing in a hands-on format here shortly. Before we get into some of the specific style attacks, I want to go down here to some of the popular tools. There's no shortage of tools here in the wireless section. Again, this could take months and months and months to really master this content, but you do have some common tools that I want to highlight. Tools like Insider or Net Surveyor or Net Stumbler or Wireless Monitor, or even commercial tools like ComView, or even websites like Wiggle or Wiggly, or even something like Kismet, which is it's a great Kali or backtrack scanner, or Wireshark, which we talked about that in the sniffing modules. Other than that, there's really two other categories. You have Aircrack NG. That's its own suite of tools, which will take you months to master in itself because there's a lot of configuration options there. And then there's also the whole subject of mobile tools. These mobile tools and mobile surveying tools and sniffing tools and hacking tools and exploitation tools, they have come, years ahead of themselves in the last 5 years or so, being 2014 now. Otherwise, the next best thing to do is to really look at the style of wireless attacks from the principles, okay? Meaning confidentiality, integrity, authentication, availability, and things like that. All right, so let's take a look at some availability style attacks. My favorite is jamming the signal. All right, you have hardware jammers, you have software jammers, but nonetheless, you're basically, the principle here is knocking someone offline or they can't play either. All right, you could just steal the access point. You could force all of the clients to do a disassociation, therefore knocking everybody offline. You could flood the device with EAP failures, and therefore overwhelming the access point. You could do beacon floods. Again, overwhelms the access point, knocks it offline, or makes it temporarily unavailable. You could do a distributed denial of service attack or a denial of service attack. You could de-authenticate. You send a bunch of de-authentication requests. These are called de-authentication floods to the access point. You could intervene with a routing style attack. You could not only flood it with de-authentication floods, but also with authentication floods. You could manipulate the ARP cache of the access point. You could try to send a signal to the access point to put it in power savings mode, so just shut it down. Or you can go into specific exploits like TKIP and MIC attacks. All right, and you can look these up within the Metasploit framework and things like that. Confidentiality style attacks, focusing on disclosure-oriented attacks. This is where you have things like just eavesdropping, right? Using a packet sniffer, something like Wireshark or T-Shark or something to that effect. Or just, you could chalk that up to traffic analysis. You could try to crack the web key. If the web key is disclosed to you or the encryption key is disclosed to you, that's, now no longer secret. You could set up an evil twin access point, so everybody connects to your evil twin, and then you forward the traffic onto the real access point, therefore getting a copy of everybody's traffic. You could set up a honeypot, or a honeynet even. You could do a session hijacking attack, let someone connect to your wireless network legitimately, and then just take over their existing session. You could masquerade as someone else, or you could just go a full-blown man-in-the-middle attack. Meanwhile, you have integrity style attacks like data frame injections. The key to an integrity attack is it's changing, modifying, or altering something with the network traffic. So data frame injecting, you're inserting in, therefore changing the integrity of the network or the traffic, therefore that's the attack. WEP injection, data replays, initialization vector attacks, even bit flipping attacks or access point replay attacks, or even replaying radius server information, or even creating your own network virus. Then you could focus just on authentication, like focusing on, well, how does the access point share its pre-shared key? You could focus on the type of authentication, like PEEP or LEAP, or go after the login portal in itself, like a VPN login portal or the access point login, or try to crack the domain information if it's linked to something like Kerberos, which ultimately could result in things like identity theft, or if you steal somebody else's identity, then you could pretend to be them when you're actually logging in, or simply just guess the key. All right. Otherwise, that's the basic framework of what happens in the wireless world. So let's look at some basic countermeasures here. If you were to try to stop the penetration tester, what could you possibly do? I'd personally add not much, but let's start somewhere. Okay, try using non-regular pin keys. In other words, we normally go to our keypads and we can do like a 1, 2, 3, 4 and A, B, C, D. But there's certain alt sequences that we can also use that are non-standard. This definitely slows the penetration tester down. You should use the latest, greatest, and strongest encryption. Probably goes without saying. You know, I personally laugh when I see something that's encrypted with WEP because I only need about 5 minutes to crack the key. You should always monitor any sort of pairing of the devices between the client and the server. So monitor the traffic, monitor the relationship of the client and the server. Put your devices in a non-discoverable mode or a hidden mode. Now, that can be a deterrent, but to me it's just, well, why are they trying to hide things? Simply stated, if you turn off SSID broadcasts, well, you're probably trying to hide something. There's probably something a little bit more valuable. I'm probably going to go after you just for shutting it off, as opposed to the run-of-the-mill person who has their SSID in broadcast mode. So that's a little controversial in itself. You should use strong authentication, meaning something that you have and something that you know. Use a multi-layered security, like for example the OSI model. All right, so don't just rely on layer 2 techniques like MAC filtering or layer 3 techniques like route filtering, but use as many layers as you possibly can, otherwise known as defense in depth. Best practices will suggest you could turn off SSID broadcast, but you guys already know how I feel about that. Shut off the remote access capabilities of it, so you have to physically access it. That creates its own set of challenges. You should absolutely change the defaults. Anytime you have a default, that's something I can go after as a pen tester. You should use MAC filters or time of day filters. Physically secure it. You know, I always see like bunny ears popping out of the ceiling. I wouldn't consider that physically secured. If you can, put it in a wiring closet where it's actually physically locked. In theory, you can use isolation, but the countermeasure to that is I can use some sort of amplification to get access or increase the signal strength. Also, you should use intrusion detection or intrusion prevention systems, or just start penetration testing practices or best practices in themselves. So as you can see, there's a lot that goes on in the wireless world. This is absolutely its own field of studies. There are several certifications that map to this, but what I find in the world of computer people is either there are really good people with the wireless, or there's not at all. All right, there's like no middle ground, and so we're trying to change that. You know, we want to get everybody familiar with the basics of wireless. Not everybody has to be a wireless pen tester, but some simple basics go a very, very long way into stopping people from eavesdropping or doing integrity attacks or availability attacks or disclosure attacks on your network. So keep all of this in mind when we look at some of the hands-on examples.